And I'm glad it's at the end, but I'm also really missing it already because it's been a wonderful year. A wonderful year with a lot of old friends and some new friends. And that's kind of the theme of this morning. Happy Juneteenth weekend, happy Father's Day, and the happiness of having old friends and new friends this morning. The old friend is, of course, Michael Shea behind me, playing just the most inspired piano, most deep, soulful piano playing that I know of, and he is with us often. And we have a new friend. She's so new that I have to read about her with my glasses. Performer, singer, writer, storyteller whose work springs from and is inspired by the cultural traditions and history of African Americans. Her work is also informed by the legacy of teaching she inherited from 3 generations of Black women educators. She has worked collaboratively with community-based arts and cultural organizations throughout her career in urban education and teacher development. For more than 5 decades, she has sung jazz, spirituals, and gospel in small and large vocal ensembles. Having the Western Classical Vocal Foundation, she loves singing in large, highly regarded choral ensembles, including the New England Spiritual Ensemble, Gospel at the Pops, and as a soloist in the annual Langston Hughes Black Nativity production of the National Center of Afro-American Artists in Boston. Wow. Paula Elliott, and I thank Crystal Rollins Jackson for bringing Paula to our attention. We're so glad to have you here for the first time. Welcome.
I hate to have him stop right now, but but we're here about Juneteenth, and so the music that we've selected is really grounded in our chance to witness the experience of African Americans from the ways in which they were brought to this country and how we find our ways today. Hold on. Nora, Nora, let me come in. The doors are captured and the windows pinned. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on, but you don't gonna bend your back. Can't go forward if you're looking back. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on. If you want to get to heaven, let me tell you how. Just keep your hand on the gospel plow. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on. Nora, Nora, she didn't let me in. I kept my right foot going forward. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on. If that plow stays in your hand, it'll land you straight to the gospel land. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on. hold on. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Just a few announcements. First and foremost is about a little last-minute thing that we're just very excited about, and it starts this afternoon. The Golden Rule sails into Boston Harbor. The Golden Rule, the same sailboat that in the 50s sailed into the waters of the Pacific where the nuclear bombs were being tested in Bikini and Alamogordo, and were turned back by the U.S. Navy, of course, and then another sailboat tried to enter, and they kept on, sort of Greenpeace style, a vessel doing education about nuclear disarmament, and the vessel fell into disrepair, but was recently refurbished thanks to the group Vets for Peace. Vets for Peace will be holding 2 p.m. Manifestation at the Christopher Columbus Park, which is right near Fan Pier, where the sailboat will be anchored for 3 days. And there's a series of events, and the one we're most involved in is tomorrow night, 5:30. It's a reception for the crew, along with we'll hear from the crew at 7 p.m. is the actual event, a dinner first. Anybody is welcome to be here, 5:30 tomorrow night, 19th, Juneteenth. And in the evening, we will hear from the crew and talk about their adventures plying the Pacific coast, the Mississippi River, and now the Atlantic coast, doing education and advocacy around bringing an end to nuclear weapons on the face of God's earth forever. And you got to keep on believing that that's a possibility. You just got to have hope and have belief that this can happen and will happen. It's not just Don Quixote sort of stuff. It can happen, and we will keep on believing that. So join us tomorrow night. Here, 5:30 dinner and 7 event. There's a documentary that they will show, and they will talk about their experiences. And that's the end of our season. We're ready to sleep for a couple of days because it's been a very, very full series of event after event after event. But we do have a few things coming up this summer that we're very excited about. And I want to introduce to you Amar Ahmad, who will tell us about an event he's been working on very hard, sort of a throwback to community churches' old days when we met in large auditoriums and heard from all sorts of voices of note, be they religious figures, be they diplomats, be they scientists, be they educators, be they storytellers, poets. Langston Hughes spoke, so did Robert Frost, on and on. So we have this event, and I want to just let Amar tell you all about it right now.
Thanks, Dean. So on July 12th, Community Church of Boston, July 12th, which is a Wednesday, Community Church of Boston is hosting, along with 3 other co-sponsors, Community Church of Boston, the Trap Rock Center for Peace and Justice, the House of Peace, based in Ipswich, Mass., and Boston Area Assange Defense. All of us together, we're hosting Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at Roxbury Community College at the Media Arts Center. That's their auditorium. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is running for president. He's challenging Joe Biden in the Democratic primary. So we're gonna host him for a live event, which is also gonna be broadcast digitally. He's very controversial for his position on vaccines, his position on the Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, and recently he's gotten into some controversy about the Palestine-Israel situation. So we're gonna have a discussion with him, and we're gonna address all of this stuff. The theme of the night is going to be peace. So he's gonna lay out his peace platform and his foreign policy views. So I'm going to take a second. I'm going to share on the screen the announcement so people can see it. So here's the, I think you guys can see this on the screen, right? Yeah. Okay, here's the announcement. So it's a live event. We're selling tickets. They're $10 a piece, even though we have reduced and free tickets available for people who need them. It's actually $12 because there's a processing fee. But that's for the live event, or you can watch online for free on Zoom or on YouTube. So I'm going to share these links in the chat. And that's the announcement. Come and join us on Wednesday, July 12th at Roxbury Community College. Thanks, Dean.
Thank you, Omar, and we're excited about this event. And a couple other things coming up. There's a July 4th anti-imperialist picnic that happens every year. Dan, the Bagel Man, Kontoff, organizes it, and that happens on the banks of the Charles River, right there by the Christian Herder Park in Alston, right near the canoe and kayak landing. So check out the July 4th anti-imperialist picnic. Also, I will tell you about a speaker we're very excited about. We haven't pinned down a date, but his name is Mazen Kumsia, and he's been here a number of times before. Mazen is the founder and director of the Palestine Museum of Natural History in Bethlehem. Mazen is a biologist and also just a marvelous, just charismatic, comedic speaker. And the last time we had him, it was 7 o'clock here, and he had to cancel his tour, but he was still willing to do it from Bethlehem, even though it was 3 in the morning in Bethlehem, and he was glad to do it. 3 in the morning. So this kind of just tells you a little bit about Mazen. We're looking forward to it. It'll be in the late part of September. A little tiny bit of care and concern and joys and sorrows. Ron Elbert, our recent board member, is still at Mass General, barely coming out of a coma that he's been in for about 3 weeks and starting to have just signs of some activity. Steve Kellerman and I were down to visit him. So keep him in your thoughts and prayers. A real joy is that I have made contact with Jim Casteris. I hadn't talked to him in several months. Jim, at age 91, had recently moved to Maine to live with his 2 daughters, back and forth, Appleton to Winterport, Maine. And his phone wasn't working anymore. Jim was the mainstay of care of this building for around 30 years. Just incredible, reliable, just Rock of Gibraltar for us, for things regarding our 5-story commercial storefront building here in Copley Square. But his partner, who's named Marguerite Helen, recently passed, and there was an announcement that had Jim's contact information. So I was able to talk to Jim and had a lovely conversation, and we'll be more in touch with Jim and try to keep him on top of things. Maybe even he's on the Zoom now, because his daughter said she would try to make that happen. Jim, we love you, we miss you. So that's our joys and concerns. Also, maybe not this time, but in the future, we would like to open it up for anybody else who had any concerns about other members of the church or family members. But let's go on this time just by saying that we have a whole bunch of mugs over here. They are free for you to take home. They are about Mondo Weiss, which is the website of Phil Weiss, who spoke here last week. Philip Weiss, the journalist and prolific author on the subject of Israel-Palestine and its relationship to the United States, and his website, mondoweiss.org. So that's one more thing to tell you about. Take a mug home with you. And And nothing else that comes to mind except to bring back our wonderful new and old friend musicians for what we call the musical message, a couple songs. Thank you to both of you for being with us today.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home, a long, long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I'm all alone. Sometimes I feel like I'm all alone. Oh, sometimes I feel like I'm all alone. A long, long way from home. A long, long way from home. True believer, true believer, a long, long way from home. Sometimes I feel like an eagle in the air. Sometimes I feel like an eagle in the air. Sometimes I feel like an eagle in the air. But a long, long way from home. A long, long way from home. True believer, true believer, and a long, long way from home. Thank you. We're really trying to hold all of the selves that operate within Black folks in this country over time. So I'm trying to think about the grief, the sense of loss, and always that sense of potential and joy. So with Motherless Child, we have this sense of loss, and still this sense of possibility. But I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. Is also part of this situation here. So this is what we're going to do. I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all these chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things I know I could say. to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove the bounds that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Maybe you'd see and agree. Everybody should be free. I wish I could give all the love I have to give. I wish I could live like I'm longing to live. I wish I could do all the things I know I can do. Though I'm way overdue, I keep starting and anew. Like a bird that's in the sky. How sweet it would be if I found that I could fly. I'd soar in the sun, looking down at the sea, and you'd agree, and you'd see everyone could be free. And I'd see, 'cause I know how it feels to be free. And I'd sing, 'cause I know how it feels to be free. We can't keep it stopping, we're just gonna keep it rocking. Come on, because we're gonna have time to sing. We're gonna have time to swing. I wish I could feel like I know how I should feel. I wish I could be all I'm longing to be. I'd soar in the sun and look down at the sea. And I'd sing, 'cause I know how it feels. Oh, yes. How it sweet, sweet, sweet feels. How it feels to be free. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, all right.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Michael. Beautiful, inspiring. I wanted to read something real quick to you. We used to read this every Sunday, and we haven't read it in a long time. It was kind of printed in our program, and it's called Statement of Purpose. I was reminded of it a couple of days ago. And here's how it goes. The Community Church of Boston is a free community of human beings united for the study and practice of universal religion, seeking to apply ethical ideals to individual life and democratic and cooperative principles to all forms of social and economic life. That's a statement of purpose that, interestingly, is on our founding document, which is on the wall, framed, with one little difference, which is interesting. That founding document, it doesn't talk about universal religion. It doesn't mention religion at all. But what became our statement of purpose adds universal religion. Take it for what it's worth. And then there's the sort of community church Talmud, which is a stack of documents like this high over the years of different people trying to figure out what Community Church of Boston is. And that's an interesting bunch of interpretations of this initial statement of purpose. Anyway, I just thought I'd share with you that before my phone goes dead. And then I would get the privilege of introducing our speaker today. I was just going to say, no, actually I'll say it after I read Dr. Bellinger's introduction. Robert Bellinger has a BA in Psychology and Black Studies from Amherst College, a Master's of Education from Harvard Graduate School of Education, a Ph.D. in History from Boston College. As an educator, he has taught at the preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school, university levels. After a teaching career of almost half a century, Dr. Bellinger is now an independent public historian, using history as a foundation and recognizing that people and their cultures do not exist in isolation necessitates an approach that is interdisciplinary, cross-cultural, and comparative. And the way I was going to introduce him was just to say, Dr. Robert Bellinger is Mr. DeSantis's worst nightmare. Dr. Bellinger, welcome.
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to the Community Church for having me here. I am, as the title of the talk is, Landmarks of Slavery and Freedom, Perspectives of a Public Historian Through an Afrofuturistic Lens. And a public historian focuses on history for the general public. And that is what I plan to do. One of the questions that often I have heard is, what is the significance of Juneteenth for Massachusetts and for the United States? So that is a question that is underlining what I'm going to say today. But I want to put freedom celebrations into a greater context, because I think that's important for us to have a greater context as we think about them. Now, one of the things as a public historian, I get to work with a lot of great institutions and people. One of those institutions is the Robbins House in Concord, Massachusetts, which is the home of an early 19th century free black family, descendants of Caesar Robbins, who gained his freedom during, as a result of his service during the American War for Independence. The generations of his family continued to not only maintain their freedom, but also to work for the freedom of others. His granddaughter, Ellen Garrison, brought one of those first cases under the 1865 Civil Rights Act. As we examined, the board and I examined this history of the Robbins House and the members of the family, we began to understand that the fight for civil rights was something that took place long before the era of the 1950s and 60s that we call the Civil Rights era. And it continued long after. And we began to talk about it in terms of the long civil rights movement. And so that is something that I bring also to this, recognizing that freedom did not happen at one point in time. So it was a long march on the road to freedom. And so I want to consider African American freedom as the result of many moments, as a result of many moments engaged in by many people over many years. So that is what I am focusing my talk around. What I'd like to do to start off is talk about a few things that are important for understanding or setting a platform for what I'm going to say. And the first is, I don't know if you knew that this was the International Decade of People of African Descent. We still have another year for that. The UN proclaimed it, and it's something that did get some celebrations, but did not get a whole lot of attention. So I always like to mention it because it's an important fact. Also, the past is present. Often when we're looking at history, we think of, people don't want to talk about the past. They want to have you forget about it. Oh, continue. Yes, we're a couple slides behind, but yes. So these two figures on here represent to me that the past is present. On the left, the figure is Harrison Ruffin Tyler, who is 95 years old this year, and he grew up steeped in family history. He was raised in his grandfather's hunting lodge. His grandfather was John Tyler, the 10th president of the United States, born in 1790. Right? That's the 18th century. So this person is just 2 generations away from the time when the United States was beginning as an independent country. The man on the right is Daniel Smith, and he just died less than a year ago on October 19th, 2022. And he was just 1 generation removed from slavery, as his father, Abram Smith, was born on a plantation in Massey's Hill, Virginia in 1862 during the Civil War. Abram was 70 years old by the time his son Daniel was born in Connecticut in 1932. He was considered the last living descendant of an enslaved person. So both of these folks were walking around in the 21st century, breathing the same air we breathe, but connect us to this past that, as I said, is not that distant, but that is very much present. Continue. Next one. Also, as part of what is important, is 246 years. 246 years is the number of years that there was slavery in the United States. It wasn't until last year, 2022, that the U.S. was independent for as long as there was slavery in this country. And it will be 2111 when black people will have been free in the U.S. for as long as they have been enslaved in the U.S. All right, I'm going to let you think about those numbers for a minute, because that says a great deal about the importance of freedom celebrations and what it means to be free in a slave society. So, as we move forward, I always draw from one of the films that was one of my favorites, Daughters of the Dust, in which the unborn child says, in talking about the past, she says, we recalled, we remembered, and we recollect, into the forward into the present, and dealing. So this is important because it's also talking about these landmarks of freedom. And landmarks are significant historical events, junctures, achievements that we go through. They help us measure distance, change, and progress. And when viewed through an Afrofuturistic lens, we get that sense. Because as it's been explained, Afrofuturism is about how the past thought about the future. and how African Americans dreamed of worlds they wished to occupy and soon brought into being. It is about the bright future that Black people imagined and brought into being while confronting a perilous present. Right? So this is very important as we look at the past to think about the fact that folks were not just drowning in sorrow, but they were thinking of brighter tomorrows. And it also allows us to think of those people as actors, as people who took agency and made choices. So as we contextualize this, I want to talk about 3 particular freedom days. 2, yes, next slide, that are connected to Massachusetts and 1 that is national. The first of those is August 21st from 1781, Elizabeth Freeman Day. The second, July 8th, 1783, Quack Walker Day. The third is Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, which we will be celebrating tomorrow. Now, if we think about these days and put them into context, the ideas of freedom and the depths of what it meant to people of African descent become clearer. So let's, next slide. One of the things that we know in Massachusetts is that the idea of freedom is often connected to the 1780 Constitution, right? In the Declaration of Rights, Article 1 of that Constitution, in which it says, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. Now, this is often connected to the court cases of Elizabeth Freeman and Quack Walker because their cases came to the Massachusetts courts in the years following the acceptance of this Constitution. However, we need to put this in the fuller context, right? Next slide. Starting in the 1760s in Massachusetts, there were at least a dozen freedom suits that went in. I don't list them all here, and I'm not going to talk about all of them here, but I do want to point out 2 in particular. The 1768 case of Margaret Tulip is one. Margaret Tulip pursued her liberty in a case against William Muzzy of Lexington. Margaret Tulip had been enslaved by Muzzy's grandparents, but they gave her freedom when she reached the age of 22. William tried to re-enslave her and claimed that he was her slave, her property. She took the case to court, and the courts decided that her legal status as a free woman and not a slave was conclusively recognized, and she won her freedom suit in 1770. Now, I mention Margaret Tulip because her descendants are still living in Massachusetts, and I know them, right? So it's wonderful to be able to talk about this ancestor of theirs. The second case that I'll talk about is James Somerset. And although this case was decided in England, Somerset lived in Boston from 1764 to 1769, when Charles Stuart, the man who claimed to own him, moved to England and took Somerset with him. In 1771, yes. His name was Charles Stuart, yes. Yes, very interesting, yes, especially here in Boston. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. But, in London, he was baptized on February 10th, 1771. And because baptism was often associated with manumission, he refused to continue serving Stuart and left him. Stuart grabbed him, kidnapped him, put him aboard a boat, and was going to send him to Jamaica for sale. However, when he was baptized, he was, 3 abolitionists became his godparents, and they brought a case. and the case was taken to courts before he could be taken out of England. In June of 1772, the judge, Lord Mansfield, found in favor of Somerset, and this case gave rise to a phrase that was often used, that the air of England was too free for slaves to breathe. And it gave the idea that there was no slavery in England. Thus, if a person who was enslaved made their way to England, they would be free. Now, that's not exactly what the case said, but that's how people interpreted it, right? And it resonated not only in England, but it resonated throughout the American colonies, and people talked about it for a great deal. Now, in the same time period, there were petitions for freedom. And these are significant because they talk about natural rights. These petitions by people of African descent that were sent to legislatures and to governors. And I want to, just share a few of them with you, and I'm not going to read all of them. Next slide. But I do want to read sections of them because it helps make the point. This first one from 1773, June of 1773, it says in the highlighted part that your petitioners apprehend they have in common with other men a natural right to be free and without molestation to enjoy such property as they may acquire by their industry or by any other means not detrimental to their fellow men, and that no person can have any just claim to their services. Right? Very, very important. Natural rights, that no one has claims to their services. Next slide. From May of 1774 to General Thomas Gage, we have in common with all other men a natural right to our freedoms without being deprived of them by our fellow men, as we are a freeborn people and have never forfeited this blessing by any compact or agreement whatever. Similar ideas, natural rights, not giving up those rights. Next. January of 1777. A petition of a great number of blacks detained in a state of slavery in the bowels of free and Christian country humbly showeth that your petitioners apprehend that they have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind, and which they have never forfeited by any compact or agreement whatever. Again, natural rights, but also adding unalienable rights, rights that come from God, the great parent of the universe, right? Very, very significant wording and thoughts that go into this. And the fourth one, next slide, is from New Hampshire in 1779. And it's a long one, but just the phrase that the God of nature gave them life and freedom upon the terms of the most perfect equality with other men. Again, the same idea. But then the phrase that I really love is the one that they end with as they're talking about in a land gloriously contending for the sweets of freedom. I love that phrase, the sweets of freedom. It just, 3 words, it wraps it all up. But now, next slide. If we think about the Declaration of Independence in the context of these, we understand that the idea of inalienable rights, natural rights, equality was not the brainchild of Thomas Jefferson alone, but that this was common thoughts that were being debated and discussed not only by those who often get in the textbooks, but also by people of African descent throughout the colonies. They were talking about these. And the fact that 2 of those documents occur before the Declaration was written and 2 after says something. But all 4 were written before the Massachusetts State Constitution that says the same thing, right? So these were ideas that were very, very common in black communities because freedom was something that meant a great deal. Next slide. Now, one of the things we have to think about is that During the war, people of African descent participated, but not because they were caught up in the political ramifications of England and the colonies, but because they saw this as opportunities to get emancipation, to get freedom. And so looking at what are called runaway ads of people who self-emancipated themselves, who left slavery, we get that sense. The first one from the Connecticut Journal of 1778 that I put up there, Runaway, Obadiah, an indentured servant mulatto boy, 16 years of age, 5 feet 4 or 5 inches high, of a slender make. 'Tis supposed he went to New Milford, Connecticut, with an intention of enlisting in Colonel Migo's regiment, which lay at that place. Right? So he went to enlist in the Patriot military. He represents about 5,000 to 8,000 other blacks who fought on the side of the Americans. The second one, from 1777, the Connecticut Current, Runaway, Will, a Negro man 27 years of age, talks something broken English. Said Negro is supposed to be made off towards the enemy. So he went to the British, and he represents the more than 20,000 black people who joined the British military efforts. And the third one, from 1771, Runaway, a Negro man named Prince, about 33 years old, has been used to farming business, is a handy fellow on most accounts, talks pretty good English. His design was to get off in some vessel so as to go to England, under the notion if he could get there, he should be free. Okay? Which is something that was permeating in England even before the Somerset case ruling came out. So he was on his way for freedom. These are 3 different pathways that were taken for freedom. And it was in this context, next slide, that the cases of Elizabeth Freeman and Quack Walker were heard in the 1780s. In the case of Elizabeth Freeman, Brahman Bet versus Ashley, her attorney, Theodore Sedgwick, argued that the Constitution of 1780 effectively banned slavery in the state. The jury agreed, and so Elizabeth was freed. This is where people link the Constitution to the case. However, legally speaking, the case was a ruling in a district court, and it did not extend beyond that district. And the case was not appealed, so it didn't get to a superior court, and so its impact really did not extend throughout the state. Now, in the next cases, Quack Walker cases, which there were several, in the final case, which linked the Constitution, it was made by Chief Justice William Cushing, who in his instructions to the jury said that they must consider Walker a free man when deciding if Jennison was guilty of assault and battery. Now, we don't know what impact his words had on the jury's decision, because they did not say anything about the Constitution in their decision. And in his ruling, it did not say anything. So even though he wrote that there can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational creature, it was his opinion, but it was not legal standing. So Quack Walker case, even though it connects his freedom to the Constitution of 1780 in Massachusetts, it was not a definitive ruling that slavery was at an end in Massachusetts. It was something that some people took, and the case did not have the same legs as the Somerset case, right? There were not articles about it. There was not a great deal of discussion about it. And given that, in the 1780s, next slide, the U.S. Constitution came out. And this was a pro-slavery document, as we know. It said Congress could not make rulings against slavery and the slave trade for 20 years, and it had a fugitive slave clause. Right? So it was a pro-slavery document. However, even given that, black people did not say, well, I guess we have no choice. And so, next slide, many of them, as I say, were continuing to seek freedom. And the numbers show that the numbers of blacks who gained their freedom through manumission, through abolitionist efforts, through self-emancipation, continued to increase through these years. 1790, there were 59,000 free black people in the United States. 1830, 319,000. And by the eve of the Civil War, 500,000. And one of the interesting facts is that by 1850, a higher percentage of black people had parents who were born in the United States than whites had, right? So they were really digging deep roots, and their ideas about freedom were very, very much part of that deep roots. But now let's move forward from these early two freedom celebrations of Elizabeth Freeman and Quack Walker. Next slide. And let's go to begin to think about Juneteenth. We know that on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. And we also know that it was addressed to give freedom to all persons held as slaves within states or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall be then in rebellion against the United States, that they shall be thenceforth and forever free, right? It had no bearing on the states that were still with the Union, and that's an important point to keep in mind. However, even with this proclamation, it meant that black people then were able to enlist in the military. Next slide. And in the Union Army. And they did. Over 179,000 black men fought with the Union Army, 10% of the Union forces, and 40,000 fought with the Navy. And over the next 2 years, they were very significant in bringing an end to the war, bringing it to a conclusion. And as you have the statue of the Massachusetts 54th there, they were the first to go in, and they fought throughout the war in many different battles, with their last battle being in Florida at the end of the war. So in April 9th, 1865, about 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. It meant that those who were enslaved in the Confederacy by the Emancipation Proclamation would be free. However, in Delaware and Kentucky, two slave states which had remained with the Union, it did not really have that impact on them. It did not have that impact in Texas as well until, next slide, June 19th, 1865, when Major General Gordon Granger issued Order Number 3 in Galveston, Texas, which made it clear that the people in Texas were free. This June 19th date is the basis of Juneteenth, right? 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, with the support of Union forces, slavery was considered at an end in Texas. Now, as I mentioned, Delaware and Kentucky still were not emancipated, the enslaved people. Next slide. It wasn't until December of 1865, 6 months later, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which said neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That is when it ended. We'll come back and kind of parse that out a little bit. Now, as this sense of freedom was resonating, it also impacted other places. And now, even though I'm focusing on Massachusetts and Juneteenth celebration from Texas, I have to bring in one other fact. Because many of the states that had been in the Confederacy, once they began to rejoin the Union, they had to rewrite state constitutions. And in many of those cases, it was people of African descent who were part of the delegations that helped rewrite those constitutions. Now, out of all of the state constitutions, the one I'm going to bring to you and focus on one particular phrase in is from the 1868 Constitution of South Carolina. And I focus on that one because one of my great uncles had a hand in writing it. And so I have to share it. And it will resonate with you back to those freedom petitions. Section 1 says that all men are born free and equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are the rights of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. Right? Clearly, they said we need to also have the right to defend our lives and protect our property. Right? So this is very, very significant addition to the same thing of inalienable rights and natural rights and having them. Now, let's go to the next slide. On June 19th, 1866, celebrations began of Juneteenth, of Freedom Day, of Jubilee Day, of Emancipation Day, of Liberation Day. These were all names that were used to describe that day. In Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, they began. They began to spread by the 1890s as Texans began moving to different places, particularly California and other points west. They carried these celebrations with them. And so they began to spread into areas outside of Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana. During the 1950s and 60s, for some reason, the celebrations tended to fade a little bit, but by the 1970s there was a resurgence and people began celebrating them and talking about Juneteenth a lot more. On January 1st, 1980, it became a state holiday in Texas. All right. And so that was a major, major turning point for the holiday. In April 18th, 1984, with the support of Napoleon Jones Henderson, an artist in Boston, and Charles Yancey, a counselor, the Boston City Council in meeting assembled acknowledged June 16th to 23rd of 1984 as Juneteenth week in the city of Boston and encouraged the citizens of Boston to join in the celebration. And this is one of the pamphlets I got from that year. And if you read it on the right, it gives the whole history of Juneteenth and what it celebrated, why it celebrated, how it began. And so Boston in 1984 was recognizing Juneteenth, even though it was not a national holiday yet. So that shows how it spread and how it had the ability to speak to the idea of freedom outside of the place where it began. Next slide. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Miss Opal Lee, who is known as the grandmother of Juneteenth, right? She had celebrated it for 40 years or so and had been part of the National Juneteenth Observance Foundation, pushing for it to become a national holiday. In 2016, after the second term of President Barack Obama, she launched what she called Opal's Walk to DC, right? She was going to walk the 4,000 miles from Texas to DC. Her family said, Opal, you're 89. This is not a good idea. You should not do that. So she instituted these 2.5-mile walks to represent the 2.5 years between the Emancipation Proclamation and Juneteenth. And over the years, she would make these walks of 2.5 miles to represent it in different places to get people to know about it. Then, it was about 250,000 people in Texas who became free as a result of Granger's proclamation. Finally, on June 17th of 2021, President Joe Biden signed the bill making Juneteenth the 11th federal holiday, right? So it is now a national holiday. It's the 11th, right? So it's not like this is like something that happens all the time. So it's very much part of it. However, last year, in his comments about Juneteenth, one of the phrases that Joe Biden said was, "This Juneteenth, we are freshly reminded that the poisonous ideology of racism has not yet been defeated. It only hides." Right? And that points us to something important. We must continue to be vigilant, right? Next slide. And we've seen some of that vigilance. And I bring this up, this is 2018, Colorado, right? And many of the states adopted phrases like the 13th Amendment, that there shall never be in the state either slavery or involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Well, in November of 2018, 66% of the voters voted to change that, and it now reads, "There shall never be in the state either slavery or involuntary servitude, period." Right? There is no exception to that. Last November, 4 other states, Alabama, Vermont, Oregon, and Tennessee, also removed that clause. Right? This is very, very significant step. And just this past Friday, the 16th, Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, and Representative Nikema Williams of Georgia reintroduced a joint resolution to remove that exception for slavery from the U.S. Constitution, right? So the work is continuing. Now, next slide. Since the road to freedom is long, we should celebrate each landmark along the way. We should recognize, so for me, we should recognize Elizabeth Freeman Day, even though it's something that the residents of Sheffield, Massachusetts have not had any legislation for it. We should also recognize Quack Walker Day, and just as a point of information, due to the work of Sean Osborne, who was the president of the Associated Black Citizens of Lexington, he got Senator Cindy Friedman of Arlington and Michelle Chicolo of Lexington to put in legislation, an act designating July 8th as Massachusetts Emancipation Day, also known as Quack Walker Day, and last November 1st, it was signed by Governor Baker. So it's officially a state holiday, right? Quack Walker Day. And so this year, this month, I will celebrate Juneteenth. I will also celebrate Quack Walker Day next month. And in August, I will celebrate Elizabeth Freeman Day. And just as a side note, since I mentioned Ellen Garrison at the beginning, I will celebrate April 14th, which the town of Concord has designated as Ellen Garrison Day, right? Now, I will celebrate these days as days of remembrance and as reflection on Black history and Black future. I will take time to remember the enslaved ancestors whose shoulders we stand on. I will reflect on the long march of freedom that began before the War of American Independence. And I will consider the issues that we are still facing, since I am viewing this through an Afrofuturistic lens. And I say that because Afrofuturism is as much about writing the record, expanding possibilities, and founding a future in the face of injustice. While Afrofuturism charts the joy of a rich, imagined future and a beautiful beyond, it is up to us to help make such a future possible. Next slide. And so, as we recall, remember, and recollect, we must also reimagine, re-envision, and reinterpret. And I will close with the words of Miss Opal Lee, who, in talking about why Juneteenth is for everyone, she said, "No one of us is free until all of us is free." Have a happy Juneteenth, and thank you.
None of us are free if one of us is chained. None of us are free. Solomon Burke. Oh yeah, thank you. That was beautiful. Just great. And we want to just take a moment to let you know that there is a virtual collection plate as well as a physical one somewhere in this building. Oh, it's in a beautiful basket on the table. We need your help to make these kind of programs happen and continue happening into our second century of celebration and commemoration and existence and community building. So Amar will put the link on the Zoom and the YouTube channel, and we have the basket coming around. And to even inspire you further to dig deep and be generous, we have another song from Paula and Michael. And thank you so much for being with us today, along with Robert. Yeah.
I'm chomping at the bit because one, I know of a time constraint for Michael. But I'm very inspired by Dr. Bellinger's comments. And so I think that this song is, I hope it hits home. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, yeah, that was wonderful, yeah. One day we heard a prophet speak, and this is what they had to say. A message that she hoped would reach people who were throwing lives away. She called it a philosophy, and that is why we pass it on to you, because it works so well for us and helps us get away from strife. We hope you listen carefully and know the truth will set you free, because that's the way it ought to be. This is your life. Long as you're living, always remember, time is for spending, but there's an ending. While you are sleeping, lifetime is creeping. Wake up and taste it, foolish to waste it. Simple and savor all of its flavor, long as you're living. As you're living, always remember, folks who are lazy are playing crazy. Better keep moving, keep on improving. You won't be worried after you're buried. Live every minute, put yourself in it, long as you're living. As you're living, always remember, you'll never beat life. Don't try to cheat life. We're sisters and brothers, do unto others. Love's for enjoying, hate's for destroying. Never forget it, or you'll regret it, long as you're living. Excuse me if I seem to preach and keep it going, Michael. Forgive us if we seem to preach, but there was something that we had to say. a message that we hoped would reach people who were throwing lives away. We call it a philosophy, and that is why we pass it on to you, because it works so well for us and helps us get away from strife. We hope you listen carefully and know the truth will set you free. We hope you listen to it, hope you listen to it, cause it's gonna set you free. Hope you listen carefully, cause the truth will set you free. And that's the way it ought to be, cause people, this is your life. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, Paula Elliott. That was striking, beautiful. And Michael Shea, again, just so deep. And we have a beautiful piano, and when we get to hear it played like that is just this incredible special thing. We also happen to have bought just 2 really nice microphones that help amplify it, and so the piano experience of this little room is just really special, and we hope we get to make full use of that piano. The more, the merrier, and the better. Before the Q&A, I just want to take a moment to remember Daniel Ellsberg. We hosted Daniel Ellsberg in 1971. He spoke at Community Church right before the Pentagon Papers came out. And then we hosted him again in 2020 when he received our annual Sacco and Vanzetti Memorial Award. And it was in the middle of the pandemic, and he got going, and we weren't done with him till about 2 in the afternoon. And you know, there are some speakers who go on too long, and you're going, come on. We were in just such rapt amazement and attention, listening to this senior, elder, legendary truth teller, and projecting it to our very own day today. So we say, Daniel Ellsberg presente, and you all say, presente. Once again, presente. Daniel Ellsberg presente. We now have opportunity for some question and answer before we have a delicious lunch from Luis Alonso Guzman, who has beautifully prepared it. It's going to be arroz con pollo, and on the side will be casamiento, that's rice and chicken, and rice and beans if you are not of a omnivorous persuasion. So Amar mentioned that there were some questions in the chat. Shall we start with those?
Yeah, I think Ruth Strauss had a question in the chat. Ruth, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Well, maybe we caught him unprepared. Did you mention that he had said something, made a question in the chat, Amar? Or?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at. I think they mentioned they had a question. Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead with Dennis.
Dennis Jackson, Price Taylor. Are you familiar with Sarah's long journey to Cambridge?
I've heard of it. I'm not as familiar with it.
My family, 150 years ago, Sarah had Cambridge across. My family, Sarah's long journey was a story of Cambridge public schools. She had to cross 5 whites-only schools to get to school. My family raised money to take it to court. Sadly, they ruled against her. Her father was a do-it-all for the governor, and he wrote the first book other than poetry. So I come from a family of revolutionaries, and look out, I'm going public soon.
Any other questions in the house here, or maybe on the Zoom?
It's hard to concentrate on my music when I really wanted to take notes about your talk. What about the expansion of Juneteenth around the country? I grew up in Detroit. So 50s, 60s, 70s, I had no consciousness of this. And I want to know what were the factors that contributed to that? Or, I was, just, yeah. Can you talk more about other states in the way, or the process by which certain states were able to call attention to it outside the South?
Well, from what I know, it's, part of the migrations that began in the 1890s. And as people from Texas moved, they carried those ideas with them in those celebrations. And other people picked them up, and as they moved around, they carried them forward as well. I first became aware of Juneteenth, I guess it was in the 80s. And that was when I was visiting friends in Colorado, in Denver. And that's when I first really heard about it. And then I began hearing about it more and more after that. So in the 80s, I think people like Miss Opal began really pushing for it to become nationally known. And so after 1980s, it began to spread much more quickly and much more broadly.
I loved your talk. Thank you so much. I learned so much, and it just brought so many things together. I was wondering, and I haven't really followed the Juneteenth unfolding, but I was wondering about Watch Night and the relationship between the church's celebration of the Emancipation and the Juneteenth holiday.
Okay, well, one of the things that we know is that what they call the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued in October of 1862. And it said that if within 90 days the war was still going on, that the Emancipation Proclamation would go into effect, which was January 1st. And so that night of New Year's Eve, black people in churches across the country began, the watch nights, sitting up, waiting for the news that the Emancipation Proclamation had gone into effect. And so, yes, it's part of that long march to freedom that I talked about. So it's 2.5 years later was Juneteenth. So again, even though people say, oh, the Emancipation Proclamation brought an end to slavery, we know that there were other things that had to happen and still have to happen.
Question from Kevin Devine online.
Yes. I just wanted to say a couple of things. It's not a question regarding Juneteenth, but it's about some ironies of history that I remember having worked as a caseworker at the Grove Hall Welfare Office and in the 1980s. And it came up that I met a fraud investigator. His name was Clyde Christmas. He investigated with the state about fraudulent activities and Department of Public Welfare. But the thing is, I asked him about it. I asked him a couple of some information about him having to do, are you from Grove Hall? And then he says to me, he says, no, I'm not from Grove Hall. I said, well, where are you from? He says, I'm from Canada. And then I'm finding out, I said, well, how is that? How did you end up in Canada? And then he tells me that, yeah, my parents, my forefathers were slaves in Virginia before the Revolution. The slave owner was loyal to the King of England. This is an irony of history, okay? And he said, well, I'm loyal to the King of England. They're going to string me up, those revolutionaries in Virginia who are slaveholders. He says, well, because I'm loyal to the King of England, they're going to get me out of here. I got to get out of here. So where did he go? He went to Canada. And guess what? When all his 1,000 slaves ended up being transported to Canada, they were freed because in Canada, there was no slavery in that time, in the 18th century, like that. They were loyal to the king. So it's just, to me, it's just an irony of history. And I just want to make those few comments. So anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Yes, and it's an interesting fact that some of those who were loyal to the king left with enslaved people. However, what is also more of the black folks who went to Canada did so independently because they had fought with the British. And during the evacuation of the British from Savannah, Charleston, and New York City, many of those who had supported the British left and went to Canada, to Nova Scotia, because during the war, the early days, Governor Dunmore of Virginia had issued a proclamation that any enslaved person who came and supported the British would be given freedom and land. And so many went to them. And one of the, you mentioned ironies, one of the ironies of history is that the American forces in the South, a portion of them were put to work trying to keep enslaved people from escaping to the British. So they were fighting for independence, but fighting against emancipation. And so that is one of the ironies, in my opinion. But they did go to Canada. Canada had ended slavery, and in fact, but early on, Canada had slavery, and there were issues of people who crossed from Canada into New York to get their freedom, as opposed to what we know as the Underground Railroad going north to Canada. And Canada becomes that place, particularly after 1850 with the new fugitive slave law, which said, made it much easier to re-enslave people. And at that point, people began moving to Canada as the end point of the Underground Railroad. And the first month of the law, the black population of Canada increased by like 10,000. It devastated membership in the churches at the African Meeting House in Boston as well, because so many people left for Canada. And many of them have descendants who have come back into the U.S. So yeah, there's a very interesting and a long history there.
Thank you.
Another question on Zoom?
Yeah, I'm going to read a question from Jose Aleman, our board member. Jose writes, thank you for your comprehensive account from slavery to freedom. I see that in Massachusetts, the trend is positive towards acknowledging our Black history and the people who fought for their freedom and the freedom of others. Jose's question, do you see dangers ahead of us in Massachusetts, in public education, in civic life, and public life in general?
That's a wonderful question, and I would say that, as I mentioned, we have to be ever vigilant. And given the climate of the times, yes, there are some dangers and pitfalls ahead of us, but we have to be vigilant about that, particularly in education. And we have to really think about what it is that we want, not just what we want our children to learn, but what kind of citizens do we want to produce? And what kind of country do we want to have? Because that has an impact not only on education, but also on all kinds of activities that we support and engage in, and the kinds of celebrations that we have. And so I think we need to have an expansive view of that and have one like the church here has, where it says all races, all religions, all cultures, all genders, all orientations. We have to embrace our common humanity.
I'd like to ask a question, Dr. Bellinger. Just if you'll tell us either in your own words or where to find more about the actual moment of emancipation. I couldn't imagine that it was just like suddenly, oh, the slaves are free. They walk off the plantation and everything is fine. After 200 more plus years of slavery, I'm just curious what that transition was like. And you know, it seems like there was initially all this hope with all these black representatives and senators in Congress and state bodies, and it took like 20 or 30 years for Jim Crow to really get in place and all those monuments get put up and all that. But the actual moment of emancipation, I'm just curious to find out what that was like and how it happened and what support there was for freed slaves, that sort of thing.
Well, as I said, there was no actual moment, right? There was not one moment. And what we have to keep in mind is that throughout the years of the war, many of those who were enslaved emancipated themselves, right? By leaving the plantations, by taking it upon themselves to have their own freedom, right? There was also, during the war in the South, if you keep in mind that many of the men, right, of, you know, age were joining the Confederate Army, right? Much of the plantations kept operating because of the work of those who were enslaved, right? They managed those plantations, they kept them going. And so they were really more than ready for freedom, right? We think of, oh, what would they do? But they had been doing this work. They had been managing these plantations. They had been growing the crops. They knew. One of the interesting factors, though, is that often when they got land, especially after Field Order number 15, which gave land of the Sea Islands to the enslaved, they wanted to continue, they wanted to grow crops that they could use for their own sale. And the Union Army often said, no, 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 we need you to get these cotton crops in so that we can make this profit, right? So they were more than ready to independently operate, right? And it wasn't just what would be done. And it was almost immediately following that end of the war that you began to have Jim Crow, what came to be Jim Crow, sliding in. And it could not have happened without the support, not only of the state governments, but of the federal governments and courts, right? And so that's something to keep in mind, and that was a detriment to black freedom more than anything else.
I'm going to add my 2 cents, which
Please do.
Ironically, they have Lincoln on both of them. The 2 cents, I'm going to add my 2 cents, which might not be worth much. But this city is like an illusion. This city is an illusion.
If you could just hold it like this.
Oh, okay. The city is an illusion. It's like the Wizard of Oz. And no one knows who I am. So I'm Dorothy, who's also Theodore Roosevelt. If you read, I like to read. And read places, read words, read rooms, read situations. And people think I'm like, people don't know how to interpret me. And I ended up learning some Spanish because people don't know how to interpret me, right? And in Jamaica, where my father is from, they called a double-edged sword a Spanish sword because the Spanish colonized Jamaica Oh, pirates, yes, they rob I. You know what I mean? The Spanish colonized Jamaica. Oh, pirates, yes, they rob I, and the English were pirates, and they did rob, you know? And one crazy thing, I'll stop because I feel like I'm on the wrong track and the wrong train in my life, so I won't talk too much. But I didn't know that bacalao was codfish. Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, they're bacalao, bacalao, bacalao. And then when I finally eat it, I'm saying, this is codfish. And it has some connection to Cape Cod, which is not far from Boston. And I guess I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that.
Well, your comments were worth more than 2 cents, and thank you. And one of the one of the things you point to is the codfish, right, which is the state fish of Massachusetts. And that cod that was fished was often dried and salted, and it was used to send to the Caribbean to feed enslaved people, right? So that was very much a connection that did take place.
I have one, just two little ornaments. I went to Jamaica with my father. We brought some codfish to my father's cousin, and they speak a little bit of Spanish in Jamaica because they're so close to Cuba, and because they're geographically close, but they're also two birds of a feather. Two birds of a feather. You know what I mean? They call Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic and Cuba two birds of a feather, but Jamaica and Cuba are also two birds of a feather. And when I went to Jamaica, my father's cousin, when we were coming, he sees my father with something in his hand. He says, ¿Qué es esto? I said, bacalao. From what Spanish I picked up.
Yes.
I just wonder, with the history that you're sharing and with, there's so much, I feel like history in terms of what's happened in this country is getting so much deeper. You know, there are things that I've been trying, you know, just as an amateur, reading our history for many years, and it's with all the information coming at you in general, it's just so much. And I just wonder, I do anti-racism work, and there's so much ignorance just at a bottom line level about, I mean, even people who are against CRT that don't even know what CRT is. It's so there's such a space, especially among the white population, of just a basic understanding of what this history has to do with them. So for people that are like me or even at the beginning that don't have any clue, they mean well, where do they start? What's a starting place to learn a history that's been systemically repressed?
Wow, that's a very difficult question of where to start. I would say the first thing to do is pick up a book, and there are so many wonderful texts written for all different levels. And one of the first things I think is for people to begin to shift their way of thinking, right? Because often when we, you know, as Miss Opal said, as long as one of us is not free, none of us is free. And what people forget is that the institution of slavery, first of all, was a national institution. It was not just a Southern institution. And that New England was very, very much implicated in it, even after they stopped practicing it within the borders of their states. They were still investing in it, still profiting from it, and so forth. And what we have to recognize is that the institution of slavery was a very intimate institution. with people who were enslaved and people who were enslavers living cheek by jowl, right? Interacting with each other on a daily basis in all of the negative and positive ways that humans interact with one another. And that's the first thing, because no one was untouched by it, right? And once you begin to think of that, then you want to know a little more, perhaps, right? And begin reading. I would always say one book, which may be hard to find now, is Lerone Bennett's Before the Mayflower. It's an excellent book. It's very readable, and it makes a strong statement that black folks landed in Virginia the year before the Mayflower, because the Mayflower is seen as the first, the prime, right? But black folks were here in what became the U.S. before the Mayflower, right? So it's very important to begin to put that history together and to begin to look, because people of African descent have long, deep roots in this country. Their blood, sweat, and tears are in the soil of this country. And one other thing we have to continue to think about, to connect to the previous comments, is that the American colonies before independence from England was part of the British Empire. So it was also connected to many parts of the Caribbean and many parts of that Atlantic world, right? And so it wasn't separate, right? And so we have to, and when we begin to think of it in that broader sense and begin to include what other parts of the African diaspora, ooh boy, we get some really interesting insights. But I would say begin by asking yourself, how does it affect me? How did it affect me, right? There are some, and I'm not thinking of what books I would suggest, but I'll think about that, and if, you know, I'll give you my information and I can share that with you. Yes.
There's a Sylvia online who would like to join
Yes.
us.
Yes,
Go ahead, Sylvia.
I just want to make, I'm so glad you mentioned the recent constitutional change in Vermont. It was called Proposition 2. It took some effort on the part of organizations I can't name, but you know, but I just, in that clause that was so still onerous that we had to point out to people was that they were it eliminated slavery, yes, except for people under the age of 21. And a member of a Universalist church I attended when we were talking about promoting that and vote for that, he said, well, I think that was right to not free anybody under the age of 21. And that's last year. So obviously it was not an African American who wanted to keep that clause in our state constitution, but it did pass, and thank you for mentioning it. Yes.
Thank you.
Paula.
I just wanted to pick up on a point in terms of not only the value of being guided or directed to particular sources of knowledge about this history, but also I'm sort of struck by the space in terms of the function of Community Church of Boston, in terms of creating community and a space where people can come together. I've known of this organization for a long time. So I'm not just plugging this just to plug it, but also the value of being connected in some way to an expanded community. Donna uses the word sometimes container. You know, you created community in many ways with the Boston Busing Desegregation Project. You know, there are other people in the room, Cardina's work. I mean, there are ways in which you build a network of folks that with whom you can have thoughtful conversations. And you also have an appreciation of, you recognize that they aren't trying to position themselves as having answers all the time, but are willing to sort of tease out questions. And so I think having that social network can help people have source of some place to go when they have honest questions, or they just get really scared about what they're learning and going like, well, I don't want to go any further. but who's going to yank my chain? So there's a level of trust that's necessary in those spaces. So, you know, because there's so many, just the contradictions in being in Boston or being in this state, and the idea of just saying it's a celebration. I've struggled with, how do I celebrate when I know that, whether I know it directly or not, there's some other funky stuff that's going on here, so we need to have that out. But, so anyway, so I'm just lifting up this space and others that will support people's pursuit of this extended knowledge. So I'll give this to him.
Thanks, Paula, for saying that about community church, and we echo your thoughts. Something else?
2 more cents, just 2. Just 2. We Are Family. If you read Kindred, that's a good book by Octavia Butler. If you read Kindred by Octavia Butler, or if you just open your eyes. If you just open your eyes, you can listen to Bob Marley. Wake up and live. And I feel like that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to live. And I had moved to Philadelphia for a little bit. I was there in 2020. I was there in 2020. And I'll just say one more thing, 2 cents, just 2 cents. Someone said to me, I spoke about the statue in Boston of Lincoln, you know what I mean? Doing whatever he was doing, you know what I mean? There was a statue in Boston of Lincoln. And when I was in Philadelphia, I told a friend from New Bedford about it. She said, I've seen it. I'm like, oh, you saw it? She said, I've seen it, right? And then she said, I've seen it. Oh my God, she said, I've seen it. You know what I mean? She said, I've seen it. And when I was in Philly, they told me, when I showed it to people in Philly, they said, that's why I'm not going to Boston. And I didn't say a word, but I'm like, what about that mayor? What about that statue of Frank Rizzo? What about that statue of Frank Rizzo? That's my 2 cents.
Yes, very interesting. But I'll just say that the statue in Boston was a copy of the original, which was in D.C. And there's a whole history of that that I won't go into now. But I think one of the things, as Paula was saying, is spaces are important. But as she demonstrated by uplifting us in song, the importance of listening to music that resonates positively and powerfully with us. Novels also, such as Octavia Butler's work, resonate with us. So it's not only reading history, but it's reading things that point the direction towards common humanity, towards freedom, towards uplifting the human spirit. And I think, and as my wife would testify as a choreographer and dancer, that also in dance and movement, we uplift the human condition. And so I think in all of those things are important. And I think that as we talk about education, right, too often we think of education as being math and English and so forth. But I am a very big proponent that the arts are an essential part of education, because I believe in holistic development. And the arts are very much a part of that. Learning how to move, how to sing, how to hear, how to see. Looking at art, appreciating all of those things is as much a part of being human as being able to do mathematics. So I think we need to really push for an expansion of what we think of as education and begin to give young people something creative that they can pursue. Because as one of my teachers and mentors, and Bill knows this, my friend Bill in the audience, Sonia Sanchez, used to say that if you block young people's opportunity to be creative, that energy turns into ways to be destructive. Right, so we have to open more avenues of creativity, not only for young people, but for all people.
We had a question like this a little bit ago, but I want to ask again. Are there any books you would recommend to people and to children and to schools for education?
Ooh, those are, you know, there are so many books bouncing in my head that right now, huh? Oh yeah, Stamped from the Beginning is a good book. There's one by Ibrahim Kendi, which is a big, thick one for adults, but he also has one for children and young readers. That would be one that could be started. There's some other ideas here.
Book recommendations. We opened the can of worms.
And when we talk about where do we begin, we have to find the connections, like my sister here was talking about, the Caribbeans with African Americans, and not see our divide. Because I think that's one of the problems of Black folks, period, is that we deal in these tribal communities and we forget, you know, as John Henry Clark said one time when we went to hear him speak, great historian, rest in peace, that, you know, when we get into all of this, he asked one of the audience members, well, whose cotton did you pick? We were all picking something, just in different parts. But getting back to your point, what should we be reading? 2 years ago, I read a book called Born in Blackness, and it's the most incredible historical account of our journey in the diaspora. But it starts with our saga of even dealing with how we were treated by the Arabs. We're talking about the 13th and 14th century. So this is a journey that we have been on, seems like forever. So if we just start at this place and we're not looking at what came before that, then we're still at a loss. We got to keep digging back and back and back to find those interconnections that my husband alluded to.
I was just going to plug the Zen Education Project. And if I don't know if this is on your website, but they do fabulous work. There's some fabulous educators. I know they've been taking big hits with all this CRT foolishness and so forth. But anybody that's interested in a very comprehensive, very well-researched source for books for young people, for teachers trying to figure out how they teach under these circumstances. If you go to the Zen Education Project, you'll just have a wealth of opportunity to get resources that can help you in your own journeys or young people across the lifeline.
Yes, and as you mentioned that, it reminds me of what an impact his book, People's History, had. But also a book that, if you want to look at the connection between rights and education, is Radical Equations by Bob Moses, who was a wonderful activist from Cambridge, and who they still have a conference in his name. So, you know, look for that. Go to events, look for speakers, because that's something you'll find. Yeah, there's so many books that I've read over the years, and to single out one, my mind is going blank right now.
We celebrated Zin's 100th birthday this year with a program featuring his son, Jeff Zinn. Howard Zinn spoke many times at community church throughout the 80s and 90s. The last time he spoke was 2000, when we gave him our annual Sackwin Vanzetti Award. And we are slowly in the process of digitizing the cassettes that we have up in our archives of Howard Zinn's talks. And there's a treasure trove of other stuff up there. We just digitized Rosa Parks when she was here. It's just a remarkable history that's been neglected for decades. I want to just recommend a couple of things we have in the library. One that we inherited from my friend Jim Thomas, who passed away earlier this year, and we got, there was no will, but I cleaned out his apartment, and we got a bunch of beautiful photography books. And this one is called Revolution in Black and White. Ernest C. Withers, who was had the most intimate window into the civil rights era struggle. There was a downside that he was supposedly talking to the FBI the whole time. For whatever reason, you know, some kind of what Russia that calls compromat they had on him, or something. But nonetheless, whatever the history, it's a beautiful book with incredible images of the civil rights struggle. The other one we have is 2 volumes that I just got at Boomerangs of Taylor Branch's history of the civil rights era, which is just remarkably thorough and beautifully presented, the late Taylor Branch. We also have a wonderful young adult series. There's maybe a dozen different books about different figures in African American history. I have read Nat Turner, and I wanted to catch up on Du Bois, because Du Bois spoke here many times throughout the 30s, 40s, up until 1959, soon before he moved to Ghana. And we have one digitized talk by Du Bois in 1959. It was on a reel-to-reel. We digitized it, and it's on our YouTube channel. One last comment from Dennis. Quick one, because we're hungry, Dennis.
I am a mocked man on the internet. I had 10 years ago, New York Times, LA Times, unknown sender unknown. ABC, CNN, ABC, all the media knows how dangerous my family is, because we read broadly and we think. What do you think of this signboard? I'm going to do Juneteenth tomorrow. UBI is a flashback to free meals and free housing. That's slavery, but they don't have to work. I'm a free thinker. Work is a 4-letter word, but we got to train poor people how to work their way out of poverty. And all my radical ideas competing with Amazon, where we're starting with the old and the poor, multi-level into the suburbs. I put over 50,000 hours and the media shuts me down.
This has been a magnificent morning. I want to thank Dr. Robert Bellinger,
Thank you, thank you.
and Paula Elliott and Michael Shea for the beautiful music. Brothers, sisters, our meeting is over. Now we must part, but we'll keep each other in our heart. I'm paraphrasing a song that I want to learn to sing at the end of a meeting. We will have lunch that Luis has prepared for us. We will hopefully, if you want, I'll just remind you again, go down to Christopher Columbus Park to welcome the Golden Rule. Come tomorrow night for a reception for the Golden Rule, which we'll have here, a dinner at 5:30 and a presentation at 7 p.m. Lots of other things going on. You can find out about them on our Facebook page or our website. A big thank you to Crystal Rollins Jackson for all the publicity work that she does for us. And also for bringing us this morning's speakers and musicians. Good afternoon, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Love you. Do good work. Build community.